Picture this: a Roman emperor fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum, convinced he's the reincarnation of Hercules. Another emperor tries to make his horse a government official. And one poor guy gets assassinated while literally taking a bathroom break during a war campaign. Welcome to the wildest political story ever told, the complete saga of all 80 Roman emperors who ruled for over 500 years. We're talking about the ultimate mix of military genius and spectacular madness, family drama that makes reality TV look tame, and enough backstabbing to fuel 1,000 Netflix series. From Augustus, who built the greatest empire in history, to little Romulus Augustulus, who watched it all crumble. Each of these rulers shaped our world in ways we still feel today. So hit subscribe if you're ready for the craziest history lesson you've ever heard. And let's dive into 5 centuries of absolute power, absolute corruption, and absolutely unforgettable characters.
This is the episode 3 of our long but definitely binge-worthy series on all 80 Roman emperors, where we explore the lives of emperors 21st to 30th. If you haven't watched the previous episodes on the first 20 Roman emperors, make sure you check it out in the pinned comment. Now, let's dive into our stories, starting with Emperor 21st, the Psycho Caracalla.
From military genius dad to psycho son, here's Emperor number 21, Caracalla, who became emperor at just 23 years old in 211 CE and ruled until someone finally put him out of everyone's misery at age 29 in 217 CE. Born with the name Lucius Septimius Basonianus, he got his nickname from a hooded cloak he loved wearing, though after what he did to his family, his fashion sense was the least weird thing about him. He was supposed to share power with his younger brother Geta, but Caracalla had a creative solution to sibling rivalry. He murdered his brother during a fake peace meeting right in front of their mom. Then he had the nerve to claim self-defense. This wasn't just regular family drama. It was a PR nightmare that required killing thousands of Geta's supporters to keep up the lie that Caracalla was somehow the victim here. His one genuinely good idea was something called the Constitutio Antoniana in 212 CE, which made every free person in the empire a Roman citizen, basically turning Roman from meaning guy from Rome to guy who follows Roman laws. This was partly because Caracalla thought Alexander the Great was cool and wanted to copy him, and partly because more citizens meant more people to tax for his expensive military habit. The emperor's obsession with copying Alexander led him to fight constantly, throwing money at soldiers while making coins worth less to pay for it all. His eastern campaign showed he could actually plan wars pretty well, but his methods were so brutal that he created enemies faster than a YouTube comment section. Even his own bodyguard boss started planning to kill him when Caracalla's paranoia reached murderous levels. His death in 217 CE happened while he was literally taking a bathroom break during his war campaign, killed by his own bodyguard on orders from the head of his security, who'd found out his name was on Caracalla's hit list. Talk about poor timing and even worse bathroom security. Caracalla had completely changed what it meant to be Roman, but his reign proved that even great ideas couldn't save an emperor who mixed military smarts with complete mental instability. His death would kick off another who's gonna be emperor next crisis, because apparently the Severan family's military improvements couldn't solve the basic problem of producing kids who weren't crazy. From imperial dynasty to bureaucratic takeover, meet Emperor number 22, Macrinus. This office worker turned emperor ruled from 217 to 218 CE, becoming the first guy from the middle management class to grab the top job and proving that knowing how to run meetings doesn't automatically make you good at running empires. Marcus Opellius Macrinus was basically Caracalla's chief of staff, the praetorian prefect who'd organized his boss's bathroom assassination to save his own neck after discovering he was on the emperor's kill list. At age 53, he suddenly found himself, reluctantly, acclaimed emperor by troops who needed someone, anyone, to lead them home from the disaster zone that was Caracalla's eastern campaign. His brief reign focused on trying to clean up the financial mess Caracalla had left behind, which meant ending the expensive Eastern War and, most dangerously, cutting military pay and privileges. These were smart economic policies that, unfortunately, required making the people with swords unhappy, which is generally not a survival strategy for Roman emperors. The crisis came when the Syrian imperial women, Julia Domna's sister and her family, started promoting teenager Elagabalus as Caracalla's secret son. This claim was probably completely false, but soldiers apparently preferred familiar lies to unfamiliar competence, especially when the familiar lies came with promises of better pay. His death came at the Battle of Antioch in 218 CE, where his forces were defeated by Elagabalus's supporters. Macrinus was captured while trying to escape back to Rome and executed, ending the first attempt by the imperial bureaucracy to cut out the middleman and rule directly. Macrinus had learned that technical qualifications for running government meant nothing without either dynastic legitimacy or charismatic leadership, lessons that future middle managers would remember when planning their own hostile takeovers. His death brought to power a teenager who would make Caracalla look normal by comparison.
From competent administrator to teenage religious revolutionary, meet Emperor number 23, Elagabalus. This 14-year-old Syrian became emperor in 218 CE through his grandmother's scheming and spent the next 4 years, until his assassination at 18, making Caligula look like a model of restraint and good judgment. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, this kid was proclaimed emperor through his grandmother's Julia Mace's political manipulations, claiming to be Caracalla's secret son, despite looking nothing like him. His real qualification was serving as high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabalus, whose worship he intended to make Rome's official religion, because apparently what the empire really needed was a teenage religious fanatic in charge. His achievements included trying to replace Jupiter with his Syrian god, marrying a Vestal virgin, thereby breaking her sacred vows and probably dooming Rome to divine punishment, and reportedly asking doctors about gender transition surgery, behavior that horrified traditional Romans who thought their emperors should at least pretend to follow Roman customs. The scandals just kept coming. He married and divorced multiple people, including men, which Romans considered legally impossible, allegedly worked as a prostitute in taverns for fun, and openly solicited customers in the imperial palace. His religious reforms actually reflected growing Eastern influence in Roman culture, but his methods were deliberately designed to shock and offend traditional sensibilities. His reign ended in 222 CE, when the Praetorian Guard, encouraged by his own grandmother Julia Maesa and his cousin Alexander Severus, decided they had enough teenage rebellion for one lifetime. Both Elagabalus and his mother Julia Soaemeus were murdered, and their bodies were dragged through Rome and thrown into the Tiber River, the ultimate Roman insult. Elagabalus had pushed imperial behavior beyond any acceptable limits, proving that even absolute power had cultural boundaries that couldn't be crossed without fatal consequences. His death would bring his more conventional cousin to power, but the damage to imperial prestige would take years to repair.
From teenage scandal to attempted restoration, meet Emperor number 24, Alexander Severus. This 13-year-old became emperor in 222 CE through the same family connections that had elevated his crazy cousin, but spent the next 13 years until his death at 26 trying desperately to restore traditional Roman values while facing military challenges that would ultimately doom his efforts. Born Alexanius, this kid was Elagabalus's cousin and part of the same Syrian imperial family, but he represented the normal branch that people could actually live with. At 13, he obviously needed adult supervision, which came first from his formidable grandmother, Julia Maesa, and then his equally tough mother, Julia Mamaea, proving that behind every successful boy emperor was a woman who actually knew what she was doing. His genuine achievements included legal reforms that protected slaves and regular citizens, financial policies that restored economic stability after years of chaos, and building programs that gave people jobs while making cities look better. Alexander's reign showed that competent civilian government was still possible, even when run by a teenager and his mom. The problem was that all this good governance happened during a period when Germanic tribes and the new Sassanid Empire were launching major attacks against Roman frontiers. His diplomatic solutions and negotiated peace treaties were smart policy, but looked weak to soldiers who expected their emperors to solve problems by killing the people causing them. His death in 335 CE came when mutinous troops in Germany murdered both Alexander and his mother Julia Mamaea, proclaiming the giant soldier MaximinusThrax as emperor instead. The army had decided that nice guys with good intentions weren't what the empire needed when barbarians were literally at the gates. Alexander Severus had proven that good government without military credibility was useless during crisis periods, while his death marked the end of the last successful dynasty and the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years when the empire nearly collapsed under external pressure and internal chaos. The lesson was clear. Being a decent person wasn't enough when the world was falling apart. From civilian government to military brutality, meet Emperor number 25, MaximinusThrax. This 8-foot-tall giant from the countryside became emperor at age 62 in 235 CE through pure soldier power, and launched the crisis of the 3rd century by proving that military force without political sense was a recipe for disaster. Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus was everything traditional Romans feared about the barbarization of their military. A peasant from Thrace who'd risen through army ranks by being bigger and stronger than everyone else. When Alexander Severus's diplomacy failed to impress frontier troops, they decided what they really needed was someone who solved problems by hitting them with very large objects. His defining characteristic was treating the entire empire like a military campaign. Maximinus spent his whole reign fighting beyond the Rhine and Danube, while squeezing provinces for money to fund his constant warfare. He never even visited Rome, running the empire through strongly worded letters, while personally leading armies against Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, who probably wondered what they'd done to deserve this giant angry man. His policies created inevitable opposition everywhere. The Senate declared him a public enemy, African provinces rebelled under the Gordian family, and Italian cities started building walls to keep his tax collectors out. When your own empire is fortifying itself against you, that's usually a sign that your leadership style needs work. His death came during the siege of Aquileia in 238 CE, when his own exhausted troops, attracted by senatorial promises of better treatment, murdered both Maximinus and his son Maximus. Even his loyal soldiers had finally gotten tired of constant war and decided that maybe someone else's leadership style might involve less marching and more food. MaximinusThrax had established the template for barracks emperors, military strongmen who ruled through force alone. But his death proved that even the most powerful generals couldn't survive when they made enemies of literally everyone. His reign kicked off the crisis period that would nearly destroy the empire over the next 50 years.
Brief interlude of aristocratic resistance. Meet Emperor number 26, Gordian the Older. This 79-year-old proconsul was proclaimed emperor by African rebels in 238 CE and ruled for exactly 21 days before his death, representing the traditional Roman elite's last desperate attempt to restore civilized government against military dictatorship. Marcus Antonius Gordianus Sempronianus Romanus was probably the oldest person ever to become emperor, proclaimed by African tax resistors who'd had enough of MaximinusThrax's brutal collection methods. At 79, he brought decades of administrative experience and scholarly reputation to a job that really needed someone who could organize effective resistance against professional armies, which was not exactly his specialty. His brief reign was spent frantically trying to build an anti-Maximinus coalition while sharing power with his son, Gordian II. Because apparently, even desperate rebels understood that 79-year-olds needed backup plans. Together, they represented traditional Roman aristocracy's attempt to prove that education and constitutional legitimacy could triumph over brute military force. The reality check came when Numidia's governor, Pupienus, who'd stayed loyal to Maximinus, invaded Africa with the experienced Legion III Augusta. The Battle of Carthage was basically a masterclass in why untrained provincial militias shouldn't fight professional soldiers, no matter how righteous their cause might be. His suicide in 238 CE, after learning that his son had died leading their amateur forces against veteran troops, ended the aristocratic rebellion after less than a month. The brief Gordian experiment had demonstrated that good intentions and constitutional authority meant nothing when facing people with actual military experience. His death proved that the old republic's civilian traditions were completely dead. Imperial survival now required either professional armies, popular uprising, or sheer luck rather than senatorial approval and scholarly credentials. The crisis would continue, but it wouldn't be solved by elderly intellectuals.
Following his elderly father into doomed rebellion, meet Emperor number 27, Gordian II. This middle-aged son co-ruled with his father for 21 days in 238 CE before dying heroically in battle while trying to defend African independence against imperial tyranny, proving that courage couldn't overcome bad military planning. Marcus Antonius Gordianus Semproianus Romanus Jr. had administrative experience as his father's assistant in Africa, but no military training for the crisis they were facing. His co-emperor status represented traditional Roman dynastic thinking. Even during desperate rebellions, Romans couldn't imagine rule without succession planning, which showed how deeply imperial monarchy had replaced republican government. His defining moment was personally leading African provincial forces against Capillianus's professional legion at Carthage, demonstrating the kind of physical bravery that his scholarly family background hadn't suggested. This decision to fight rather than negotiate showed traditional Roman values of duty and honor, even when facing hopeless odds against superior forces. The battle was predictably one-sided. Provincial militias armed with good intentions couldn't match professional soldiers with actual training and equipment. Gordian II died fighting, probably knowing that surrender would just mean a slower execution. So he chose to die like a Roman magistrate defending his people. His death ended the Gordian dynasty's first attempt at power, though his nephew would later become emperor under very different circumstances. The younger Gordian had proven that aristocratic virtue still existed in the Roman world, even if it couldn't compete with military reality during crisis periods. His brief reign illustrated the tragedy of the 3rd century crisis. Decent people kept trying to restore constitutional government, while the empire descended into military chaos that would last for decades. Good men were dying for principles that the practical world had already abandoned.
From failed rebellion to power-sharing experiment, meet Emperor number 28, Pupienus. This elderly senator co-ruled with his colleague Balbinus for 99 days in 238 CE, representing the Senate's desperate attempt to govern through committee during the ongoing crisis, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus had military experience from provincial commands, making him the Senate's choice for handling MaximinusThrax's advancing armies, while his colleague managed civilian affairs. At age 74, his appointment showed that Roman leadership had become a job for old guys who remembered when things worked better, though whether experience could fix current problems remained to be seen. His remarkable achievement was actually defeating MaximinusThrax through a combination of siege tactics, propaganda, and enemy troop mutiny at Aquileia. When Maximinus's soldiers finally murdered their emperor, Pupienus had successfully defended Italy against barbarian invasion, a genuine military victory during the crisis period that nobody thought was possible. But military success against external enemies couldn't solve internal political problems. Pupienus and Balbinus spent their brief joint reign quarreling over authority and policy, while the Praetorian Guard grew increasingly hostile to being governed by senators who thought they were too good for military input on imperial decision-making. Their deaths in July 238 CE came when Praetorians dragged both emperors from the palace and murdered them in the streets, immediately proclaiming 13-year-old Gordian III as their preferred successor. The guards had concluded that child emperors were easier to manage than elderly senators who had opinions about things without consulting the military. Pupienus had proven that even successful military leadership couldn't overcome the fundamental crisis of imperial legitimacy during the 3rd century. His victory against MaximinusThrax was meaningless because the system itself was broken, and Romans were about to try child emperors again. Joint ruler in an impossible situation. Meet Emperor number 29, Balbinus. This aristocratic senator co-ruled with Pupienus for 99 days in 238 CE, attempting to manage civilian government while his colleague handled military affairs in what became Rome's most dysfunctional power-sharing arrangement. Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus represented the traditional Roman elite's administrative expertise, chosen by senators specifically for his reputation for competence in civilian governance. His joint appointment with the more militarily experienced Pupienus showed that even desperate senators understood the empire needed both civilian and military skills. They just couldn't figure out how to combine them effectively. His job was managing Rome itself, while Pupienus dealt with MaximinusThrax's invasion, maintaining public order, organizing supply systems, and handling the increasingly hostile Praetorian guards who resented being governed by people who treated them like glorified security guards rather than the empire's kingmakers. The fundamental problem was that joint rule simply didn't work when both emperors competed for prestige and disagreed on policy. Balbinus and Pupienus undermined each other through public arguments in competing initiatives, proving that Roman government required unified command, especially during crisis periods when quick decisions meant survival. His death alongside Pupienus in July 238 CE ended the Senate's last serious attempt to govern directly rather than through military strongmen. The Praetorians who murdered both emperors had decided that even incompetent child emperors were preferable to competent adults who couldn't agree on anything. Balbinus had demonstrated that traditional administrative skills were useless without unified leadership and military credibility. His death marked the end of senatorial independence. Future emperors would rise through army support, not constitutional appointment, for the remainder of the imperial period.
From joint rule chaos to child emperor, meet Emperor number 30, Gordian III. This 13-year-old became emperor in 238 CE through Praetorian Guard politics and managed to rule for 6 years until his death at 19, showing that sometimes having competent adults run things while you learn the job actually works. Marcus Antonius Gordianus Gordianus was the grandson of the failed African rebels Gordian I and II, proclaimed emperor by guards who just murdered the previous 2 rulers and needed someone with dynastic legitimacy who wouldn't cause them problems. At 13, he represented the ultimate compromise candidate, legitimate enough to justify their coup, but young enough to be completely controllable. His reign's success came through effective regency government, first under court officials and later under Praetorian prefect Timesitheus, whose military competence and administrative skill kept the empire running while Gordian learned imperial basics. This arrangement proved that competent ministers could govern effectively even under teenage figureheads. The defining achievement was the successful Eastern campaign against Persia, where Roman forces under Timesitheus's command recaptured lost territories and restored imperial prestige. These victories showed that proper leadership could still achieve military success despite the ongoing internal political chaos that had characterized recent decades. The turning point came when Timesitheus died and was replaced by Philip the Arab as Praetorian prefect, fundamentally changing court power dynamics. Philip quickly gained control over the young emperor while positioning himself for eventual succession through careful manipulation of military loyalties and imperial decision-making. His death in 244 CE during the Mesopotamian campaign was officially called an accident, but Philip's immediate proclamation as emperor by the same troops suggested something more suspicious. At 19, Gordian III had ruled longer than most crisis-period emperors, despite starting as a child, though real power had always belonged to whoever controlled the armies rather than whoever wore the purple.
And that was the story of the 10 Roman emperors for today. If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, and stay tuned for the next episode of 10 Roman Emperors on our channel, Drowsy Rome.